On August 1st, 1920, in Roanoke, Virginia, a baby girl was born into a poor black family. Her name was Loretta Pleasant, but later on she was known as Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta shared a house with her parents and her 8 siblings until 1924, when her mother, Eliza Lacks Pleasant, died giving birth to her 10th child. Henrietta's father took them to Clover, Virginia, where the 10 children were split up between relatives. She ended up living with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks, who lived and worked in the tobacco fields their ancestors had worked in as slaves. Growing up, working and playing in the tobacco fields, Henrietta had a hard but exciting life. Her companions on the farm were her cousins. They grew up together, helping pick tobacco and sleeping in the crawl space of their house. When they weren't working in the fields, they would swim in the swimming hole, dance, or race horses down the dirt road that went to the end of the farm. The name of one of her cousins was David, or Day. She and Day became very close. So close, in fact, that they had their first child, Lawrence, just after she turned 14, and Lucille Elsie Pleasant 4 years later. Henrietta and Day eventually got married on April 10, 1941, when she was 20 and he was 25. They were not able to go on a honeymoon after the wedding because there was too much work to do on the farm. Henrietta and her small family continued to work and live on the tobacco farm until their cousin Fred, who had been recently drafted into the military, came to tell them of his success in working in a small town called Turner Station. Turner Station was a town that manufactured steel for the United States military. Many African American families moved there to get jobs that paid at most 80 cents per hour, which was good pay for blacks. Fred gave Henrietta and Day the rest of his money and told them how to get there. She and Day and their 2 children moved to Turner Station when she was 21 on a coal-fueled train. It was the first time she had seen the rolling hills or large bodies of water. She and Day had 2 more children, Sonny and Deborah, after they settled down in Turner Station, and everything was great in the family for several years. Then Henrietta began noticing a lump she felt in her abdomen. She confided in her cousins that she didn't feel right for more than a year, but they made light of it, saying that maybe she was pregnant outside of the womb. Henrietta gave birth to her 5th child, Joe, when she was 29, and the cousins told her again that the pain was most likely from the baby, but Henrietta knew they were wrong. She had felt it before she had gotten pregnant. She grew even more suspicious when she found blood on her underwear at the wrong time of the month. She filled her bathtub with water, felt herself, and found a lump at the left opening of her cervix. She immediately told Day to take her to the doctor. The doctor sent her to a gynecologist at the clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and on January 29, 1951, Day took her there. "I've got a knot on my womb," she said, to Howard Jones, a gynecologist at the clinic. Jones examined her and found a tumor.
I just happened to be the one who saw her when she first came in. And her history was very simple. She had had some intermenstrual spotting and bleeding, which is a sign of cancer, but it can be a sign of other things too.
The tumor was like nothing he had ever seen before. It was purple, the size of a nickel, shiny, and it bled to the slightest touch. As usual, he took tissue samples and sent them to George Guy, a scientist who had been trying to grow samples of human tissue outside of the body. Jones took notes, and when he was done, he sent her home. When he got the results of the diagnosis back, Jones determined that Henrietta had epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, stage 1, or simply cervical cancer. A few weeks later, Henrietta had to come back to Hopkins to begin radium treatments. This seemed to work, but the doctors wanted to make sure, so they started X-ray treatments. That meant that Henrietta had to be there every weekday for a month. She lived 20 minutes away from Hopkins, and she couldn't walk that far every day, so she told her cousins that she was sick and she stayed with them at their house. This was a big shock to them, because cancer was something you didn't talk about in the 50s. It was an omen. The treatment charred her skin from her chest to hips, but she didn't complain much. Between treatments, she would go back to cooking for her family, playing cards, and dancing with her cousins. By this time, Elsie, Henrietta's oldest daughter, had gotten too big for her to take care of. In the 50s, no one talked about epilepsy or mental retardation, but that is most likely what was wrong with Elsie. The doctors at Hopkins said the best thing to do was send Elsie to Crownsville State Hospital, or commonly known as the Hospital for the Negro Insane. No one in the family knew that the white doctors at the hospital were abusing Elsie and the other patients there. In June of 1951, Henrietta told the doctors that she thought the cancer was spreading, but the doctors didn't listen because they thought since they were white, they knew better than her. They wrote in her medical exam that she felt only a discomfort, even though she could hardly go to the bathroom and her abdomen was a stony hard mass. Finally, after weeks of listening to her requests of another examination, they gave in. They were surprised to find the cancer had spread. In her medical exam, a doctor wrote, "The patient looks chronically ill. She is obviously in pain." Tumors began appearing everywhere in her body, and on August 8th, 1 week after her 31st birthday, Henrietta came to Hopkins to stay for good. She wanted to get help from the doctors at all times. Day and the children came to visit her until they were forbidden to come because she cried when they left, so we took the kids to the lawn outside to let them play. When she could, she would get up and watch them from her window. After a while, however, she got too sick and she wasn't able to come. The doctors realized that all of the treatments were not doing her any good. They could only relieve her of her pain. They tried a few different pain medications such as Demerol, morphine, and they even injected pure alcohol into her spine. None of these tactics seemed to have any effect on her, though. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot quotes her cousin, Sadie, recalling Henrietta's suffering.
Henny didn't fade away, you know? Her looks, her body. It didn't just fade. Like some people's be sick in the bed with cancer and they look so bad. But she didn't. The only thing you could tell was in her eyes. Her eyes were telling you that she wasn't going to be alive no more.
Henrietta Lacks would not be alive for much longer. She convulsed in pain, so the doctors had to strap her to the bed. Her cousin and sister, Sadie and Gladys, sat by her, stroked her hair, cried, and stuffed pillows in her mouth so she didn't bite her tongue off when she screamed. All she was worried about, however, were her children, 2 of whom were under 3 years old. She was worried that they wouldn't be taken care of when she was gone. Henrietta died on October 4th, 1951, at 12:15 a.m. The family took Henrietta back to Clover, the place where she had grown up. She was buried in an unmarked grave near her mother's. When they lowered Henrietta's coffin into the ground, a giant storm began, the winds whipping up trees and a house which fell on one of Henrietta's cousins, killing him instantly. The family thought it was her way of telling them something, or her spirit leaving her body. What the family didn't know was that parts of Henrietta were still alive. When George Guy had gotten the tissue samples from Howard Jones, his assistant, Mary Kubikik, had successfully grown them using a method of Guy's wife's creation, a liquid for feeding cells made of chicken blood. The cells grew 20 times faster than normal cells, and they didn't die as easily. He named these cells Gila, 2 letters from the first and last name from the patient they were from. Guy told some of his closest colleagues about his success in growing the first immortal human cells. They asked to have some, and he said yes. George Guy was very proud of the cells he had grown. The same evening that Henrietta died, a video of Guy was aired on television. In the broadcast, he said,
"It is quite possible that from fundamental studies such as these, that we will be able to learn a way by which cancer can be completely wiped out."
In the room next door, his assistant was taking an autopsy of Henrietta Lacks.
I was all alone with my petri dish, and I walked in, and she was all completely open. And just, you could look in and see tumor everywhere on all the tissues, and her bladder was one complete solid mass.
George Guy did not want all of his work to be noticed by everyone, however. In order to keep himself from being sued by Henrietta's family, Guy kept the identity of Gila a secret from the world. He said that Gila had come from a woman named Helen Lane, kept her medical records hidden, and refused to talk to anyone about the woman behind the cells. Eventually someone leaked Henrietta's name to a journalist, but still no one knew who the woman was. Scientists all over the world began getting their hands on Gila and doing medical experiments on human cells that had not been possible before. Gila was sent into space to see what zero gravity did to human flesh. The cells were also placed next to nuclear bombs to see what radiation did to their DNA. Gila was also the major factor in creating the polio vaccine, which was developed in 1952 by Jonas Salk. What a majority of scientists were working on was a cure for cancer, and the American government was giving them millions of dollars to locate the so-called cancer virus. The scientists were experimenting using Gila a lot, but most of the time they didn't even know they were using the cells. After George Guy made the Gila cell line, many other scientists were able to make their own lines fairly easily. They ran tests that were specific to parts of the body their cells had come from. Stanley Gartler, a scientist interested in the different cell lines, looked at a lot of lines and noticed all of these made the same enzymes, which were only found in black people, but the cell lines he had looked at came from white patients. He came up with an awful conclusion and told scientists they had been working with Gila the whole time, even though they had thought they were using different cells. This was very shocking to them, and many didn't want Gartler to be correct. Scientists were confused as to how all the cell lines ended up to be Gila. Walter Nelson Rees, a scientist working on the problem, found that a Gila cell could take over an entire cell line. If simply one cell was dropped into a petri dish, they would grow faster than the original cells and end up taking over the entire culture. Gila cells didn't even need to be dropped in accidentally. Nelson Rees found that the cells could travel through the air on dust particles and find their way into the petri dishes by themselves. Scientists eventually admitted that Walter Nelson Rees and Stanley Gartler were correct. They were completely devastated and realized that all their results were worthless. They had wasted millions of dollars and many years. While the scientists were getting funding to do experiments on Henrietta's cells, her family was living in poverty. After Henrietta died, a woman named Ethel came to take care of Sonny, Deborah, and Joe, the three youngest Lacks children. She was married to their cousin Galen. He and his wife abused the children. Ethel would starve them and send them to the dark basement, where they had to stand on one foot facing the corner of the wall for hours on end. If they didn't have their foot up in the air when she checked on them, she would whip them with a belt. She was the meanest to the youngest child, Joe. Joe began to feel nothing and became angry all the time. Galen, Henrietta's cousin, touched Deborah inappropriately. She had to wear tight belts and pants with buttons instead of zippers in order to decrease the amounts of times he touched her. When she was just 10 years old, he tried to rape her. Deborah always wondered what happened to her mother, but no one in the family would tell her. The Lacks children's lives got somewhat better when Bobette Lacks, Lawrence's girlfriend, found out the children were being abused and took care of them like she did with her own child. Bobette pushed them to stay in school and not to have children early, especially with their cousins. Unfortunately, Deborah got pregnant with her first child when she was 16 and a junior in high school. Bobette was deeply devastated, but forced her to go to a special school for pregnant girls. Deborah gave birth to Alfred Jr. on November 10, 1966. Instead of staying home with her child and missing school, Bobette offered to take care of him herself. Joe was still an angry boy who had trouble respecting authority. When he was 18, he joined the military, but soon after he was discharged for an inability to follow the rules and adjust to military life. The family had hoped he would learn some respect there and calm down a bit, but he came back even angrier than before. One afternoon, Joe got into a fight with a boy named Ivy and ended up killing him with a carving knife. He turned himself into the authorities because he wanted to get better, and the judge sentenced him to 15 years instead of 30 because of his cooperation and his honesty. At first, he acted violent in prison, but then he found the Islamic faith and it calmed him down a lot. He spent much of his time in prison studying the Quran, and Joe eventually changed his name to Zakaria Bari Abdul Rahman. In 1973, Henrietta's family found out about the Gila cells. Bobette Lacks was having dinner with a friend and her brother-in-law, who happened to work at the National Cancer Institute. When he heard that Bobette's last name was Lacks, he grew very surprised, and they got onto the topic of Henrietta Lacks. Bobette was taken aback that he knew her mother-in-law and how she had died. She was even more surprised that Henrietta's cells were still alive and multiplying. She ran home and told the family, who were at a loss of what to do.
said, "You're working on her cells?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Her cells are still alive." And I just, you know how you, I was just truly amazed. And he said he'd been working on it for years.
And it like took us by surprise. We never knew this. And there's another thing that got me upset with him. Like, is there anything else I don't know?
Soon after, a group of researchers at the National Cancer Institute were discussing the Gila contamination problem. They began talking about how it would be good if they had specific DNA markers to help them identify Gila cells easier. One researcher mentioned that Henrietta's family still visited Hopkins, and it would be fairly easy to get a hold of them. The scientists called the family and asked for blood tests. They didn't understand the concept of immortal cells, so their intent was confused, and the family thought they were getting a cancer test. When the scientists never called them back to give them the results for their so-called cancer test, Deborah was sure she had the cancer her mother had died from, and she too was going to die. Henrietta's family grew very frustrated with the whole situation. They just wanted to know information about their mom. But no one ever explained to the Lacks family what the cells were or what their mother had done for science. When they would ask, they were given vague answers or none at all. Deborah wanted to get Henrietta recognition because most of the world still didn't know who the woman was behind Gila. Lawrence and Sonny Lacks were extremely irked by the fact that the family had never gotten any money from the cell's success. They hired a lawyer to help them with their case, but the lawyer turned out to be a con man and their case didn't go through. The Lacks family began to resent rich, white scientists who only wanted their cells and information about their mother's cells. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot captures Deborah's frustration in the following quote.
When people ask, and seems like people always be asking to where I can never get away from it, I say, yeah, that's right. My mother's name was Henrietta Lacks. She died in 1951. John Hopkins took her cells, and them cells are still living today. Still multiplying, still growing and spreading if you don't keep them frozen. Science calls her Gila, and she's all over the world in medical facilities, in all the computers and the internet everywhere. When I go to the doctor for my checkups, I always say my mother was Gila. They get all excited, tell me stuff like how her cells help make my blood pressure medicines and antidepressant pills and how all this important stuff in science happened because of her. But they don't never explain more than just saying, yeah, your mother was on the moon. She been in nuclear bombs and made that polio vaccine. I really don't know how she did all that. But I guess I'm glad she did, 'cause that means she helping lots of people. I think she would like that. But I always have thought it was strange. If our mother's cells done so much for medicine, how come her family can't afford to see no doctors? Don't make no sense. People got rich off my mother without us even knowing about them taking her cells. Now we don't get a dime. I used to get so mad about it to where it made me sick and I had to take pills. But I don't got it in me no more to fight. I just want to know who my mother was.
Everything changed for Henrietta's family when Rebecca Skloot, a science journalist, wanted to not only get details about Henrietta's personal life, but also information about her family and their struggles and publish a book about it all. This publicity was exactly what the family wanted. Rebecca started out as just a reporter for the family, but she became one of them as she got to know them more. She lived with Deborah and got to know her and her grandchildren very well. Soon, she didn't just want to write a book about the family, she wanted to help them. She got Deborah information about Elsie, whom Deborah hadn't known much about because she had died in Crownsville State Hospital soon after Henrietta died. Since the family was still very confused as to what the details were on Gila, Rebecca got them in touch with a researcher by the name of Christoph Leanger, who had agreed to show Deborah and Zachariah their mother's cells. In The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, Rebecca recalls Deborah's reaction in meeting her mother's cells for the first time.
Christophe reached into the freezer behind him, grabbed another vial of Gila cells, and held it out to Deborah, his eyes soft. She stood stunned for a moment, staring into his outstretched hand, then grabbed the vial and began rubbing it fast between her palms like she was warming herself in winter. "She's cold," Deborah said, cupping her hands and blowing onto the vial. Christophe motioned for us to follow him to the incubator where he warmed the cells, but Deborah didn't move. As Zakaria and Christophe walked away, she raised the vial and touched it to her lips. "You're famous," she whispered. "Just nobody knows it."
After more than 10 years of staying with the family and learning their stories and opinions on the whole situation, Rebecca Skloot published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks on February 2, 2010. This book got the Lacks publicity, and they began telling their story in interviews and broadcasts. People heard about it, and they pushed to have memorials for Henrietta Lacks. Some even tried to make a museum for her. Even though the family never received any money from Henrietta's cells, and Deborah died from a stroke soon after the book was published, they had gotten the public's attention, and Henrietta's legacy and her cells still remain today, 62 years since she died.